On Christmas Day 2011, another family massacre took place in Grapevine, Texas, about 20 miles northwest of Dallas. Aziz Yazdanpanah showed up to the home of his estranged wife, Fatima Ramadi. At this point, Aziz had not had a job in over a decade, leading to some pretty predictable financial problems. After separating from her husband, Fatima began doing quite well for herself. She had a nice home and was doing well financially. It is believed that seeing his wife do so well without him led Aziz to a point of rage. Wearing a Santa Claus outfit, Aziz was led into his wife's home to spend Christmas with his children. His niece, who was also present at the time, sent a sarcastic text message to her boyfriend about Aziz being at the family gathering. Only 18 minutes later, a 911 call was received, where someone appeared to be attempting to call for help. Within that short period of time, Aziz produced a handgun and began firing at his and his wife's family. He ended up murdering his wife, their 2 children, his brother and sister-in-law, and their daughter before turning the gun on himself. Prior to killing himself, he placed a second handgun in the hand of his brother-in-law, seemingly trying to frame him for the killings. However, forensic testing proved that Aziz was the only person to fire a gun at the time of the murders. Another senseless killing of a man that couldn't deal with his wife living her life without him. On Christmas Eve 2008, Covina, a suburb of Los Angeles, was the scene of what happened to be a very ordinary family gathering. 25 members of the Ortega family were celebrating the holiday late into the evening. A night of love and happiness was abruptly interrupted at around 11:30 p.m. local time. Only 6 days prior, Sylvia Pardo had just finalized her divorce from her ex-husband, Bruce Pardo. It was for this reason that police believed that Bruce Pardo had decided to get revenge. The couple had only gotten married in January of 2006. It didn't take long for their marriage to begin falling apart. Bruce had refused to open a joint bank account with his then-wife. He also demanded that Sylvia pay for any expenses of her 3 children from a previous marriage out of her own income. These were only 2 of the reasons the marriage failed, and Sylvia decided to file for a divorce. In June of 2008, a divorce court ordered Bruce to pay $1,785 a month in spousal support to Sylvia. Bruce was also ordered to pay Sylvia $10,000 as part of the divorce settlement, in addition to Sylvia keeping her wedding ring and the family dog. Bruce had confided in a friend, telling him that Sylvia was taking him to the cleaners. Between the divorce itself and the outcome of the settlement, Bruce had become more and more resentful towards Sylvia. In a court declaration, Bruce expressed his anger by stating that Sylvia was living with her parents, not paying rent, and had spent money on a luxury car, a gambling trip to Las Vegas, meals at fine restaurants, and massages and golf lessons. All of this anger eventually boiled over to a point where Bruce could no longer handle it. This leads us back to Christmas Eve. Dressed up and disguised as Santa Claus, Bruce showed up to the home of Sylvia's parents where Sylvia was living and the party was happening. With him, Bruce had a 9mm handgun in one hand and a homemade flamethrower wrapped as a present in the other. Bruce had 3 additional 9mm handguns concealed within his suit. After knocking on the door, Bruce was greeted by the 8-year-old daughter of Sylvia's sister. He shot her point blank in the face before entering the residence. Luckily for the 8-year-old girl, her wound was severe but not life-threatening. In addition to firing indiscriminately at the partygoers, Bruce appears to have also singled out individuals to execute. When he was done firing rounds at people, Bruce then unwrapped the flamethrower that he had brought with him. He set fire to the home before fleeing in his rental car. Not too long after, the entire residence was engulfed in flames, sending flames soaring 40 to 50 feet into the air. By the time everything was done, 9 people were killed. The fire was so intense it took 80 firefighters over an hour and a half to extinguish the flames, and the victims' bodies had to be identified through dental records. After fleeing, Bruce had driven about 30 miles to his brother's home, who wasn't home at the time. After senselessly murdering 9 individuals, Bruce ended his life by a self-inflicted gunshot wound in the early morning hours of Christmas Day. To tell this story, it truly begins months before Christmas. Ernest R. Hulaver Jr. was married to Jean Hulaver, with whom he had 2 daughters, 20-year-old Victoria, and 15-year-old Elizabeth. In July of 2002, Ernest was charged with multiple sexual offenses involving conduct with both of his daughters. On behalf of her daughters, Jean obtained a court order that evicted Ernest from their Middletown, Pennsylvania home. Whoever then moved in with his parents and younger brother Scott. In an act of revenge against his wife and daughters for the sexual offense charges, Ernest came up with a plan. On Christmas Eve of the same year, he had his brother Scott drive him to his former residence shortly after midnight. Scott waited in his car a block away while Ernest approached the home, cutting the telephone line before breaking into the home. Once he gained entry, he shot and killed his estranged wife and 2 daughters. The only survivor was Victoria's 9-month-old daughter, who was left alive but unattended. After the murders, Ernest and his brother Scott drove to a separate county to dispose of the murder weapon and other incriminating evidence. Approximately 28 hours after the killings, the bodies of the deceased were discovered, along with the 9-month-old child that had been miraculously spared. After this discovery was made, police obtained a warrant to search Ernest, his vehicle, and the home he had been staying at. Ernest was subsequently charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Prior to the trial, Scott, who claimed he was not aware of the murder plot until after it happened, accepted a deal of third-degree murder in exchange for his testimony against his brother. Scott led investigators to the location of the disposed firearm and was the prosecution's main witness. Scott was ultimately sentenced to 12 to 25 years in prison for his role in the murders. Ernest was found guilty for his charges and was sentenced to death. As of earlier this year, Ernest's appeal to avoid being put to death was denied. Charlie Lawson and Fanny Manring were married in 1911. They had a total of 8 children together, one of which died of an illness in 1920. After saving up money, the family moved to Germantown, North Carolina in 1927, where they had purchased a farm. From outside appearances, the family appeared to be doing very well. But only 2 years after purchasing the farm, tragedy would strike the family. Shortly before Christmas of 1929, Charlie brought his wife and 7 children into town to buy them new clothing and have a family portrait taken. For a working-class family at the time, this would have been a bit unusual, which many believe indicates that Charlie had planned out what he would soon do even days beforehand. On the afternoon of Christmas Day, Charlie grabbed his shotgun and set out on a very deadly spree. As his daughters Carrie and Mabel were headed to their aunt and uncle's house, Charlie ambushed them, shooting them both. He then bludgeoned both of them to death to ensure they were in fact deceased. He then placed their bodies in the tobacco barn and headed back to the family home. Next, he shot his wife Fanny, who was sitting on the front porch of the home. Once the gun was fired, Charlie's son James and Raymond attempted to find a hiding spot inside the home. After entering the home, Charlie then shot his daughter Marie. Next, he found the 2 small boys hiding, and then shot them as well. Lastly, he killed his baby daughter Mary Lou, who is believed to have been bludgeoned to death. After the murders, Charlie retreated from the home into the woods. The only child out of 7 to survive was Charlie's eldest son, 16-year-old Arthur. Just before the murders took place, Charlie had sent Arthur into town on an errand. A few hours after the murders, there were many people who had found out about what had happened and gathered at the family home. It was at this point that those at the home heard a gunshot coming from the woods. There, Charlie's body was found. After killing his wife and 6 of his children, Charlie ended his own life by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Friends and family members were shocked to have learned about what had happened, leading many to search for a motive. Months before the massacre took place, Charlie had sustained a head injury. This led family members to theorize that maybe his mental state could have been altered, leading to the murders. However, after an autopsy was completed and his brain was analyzed, there were no signs of any abnormalities. Another possible motive was that Charlie had been engaging in a sexual relationship with his own daughter, Marie. There were 2 separate sources that claimed that they were aware of the relationship and that Marie had even ended up pregnant by her own father. Regardless of whether or not any of this was true, what happened to the Lawson family was another avoidable tragedy. Taking a bit of a break from family murders leads us to Christmas Eve, 1885. 3 friends, Jack Doyle, Don Sullivan, and Buck Hannon, were spending time together on the night before Christmas. The trio were exchanging stories, bragging about their past sexual encounters. Things went from playful to volatile when Sullivan decided to make insulting remarks about Doyle's wife. The two ended up getting into a fight which escalated to both men drawing their revolvers. Defending his wife's honor, Doyle shot Sullivan, killing him. Doyle left after heading back into his hotel room, but was secretly followed by Hannon. To avenge the death of Sullivan, Hannon shot and killed Doyle. After realizing the situation he was in, Hannon then escaped the town on horseback. This was yet another case of killings that could have been avoidable if people just got along. On December 23, 1881, Robert and Fanny Gibbons were hanging out with their friend Emma Carrico. The three teenagers were staying the night together at the Gibbons home in Ashland, Kentucky. For reasons that are unknown, all three of the teenagers were beaten to death with axes. The assailants then set the home on fire before leaving. Emma's mother, who was next door, noticed the fire and sounded an alarm. Other neighbors in the area responded to the alarm and found the bodies of the three victims inside. A bricklayer named George Ellis ended up confessing to the crimes. His co-workers William Neal and Ellis Craft were also implicated in the murders and were all three arrested. The assailants were originally taken to Catlettsburg Jail, but were temporarily removed to avoid a lynch mob and only returned to face a trial. After a 10-day trial, both Neal and Craft were found guilty for the killings and sentenced to death. Both men appealed the verdict. Ellis was tried and convicted on May 30, 1882. He was sentenced to life in prison, but that same night was removed from his jail cell by a mob and was promptly lynched. Craft and Neal were both found guilty for a second time in separate trials in Grayson, Kentucky. Craft was hanged on October 12, 1883, and Neal on March 27, 1885. Lee Shelton was born in 1865 in Texas. He worked as a carriage driver in St. Louis, Missouri. He eventually gained a reputation as being a pimp and gambler in the area. On Christmas night, 1895, Shelton was at a St. Louis saloon with his friend William Lyons. Shelton ended up shooting and killing Lyons after a dispute. A story that appeared the following day in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat read, William Lyons, 25 years old, a levy hand, was shot in the abdomen yesterday evening at 10 o'clock in the saloon of Bill Curtis at 11th and Morgan Streets by Lee Shelton, a carriage driver. Lyons and Shelton were friends and were talking together. Both parties, it seems, had been drinking and were feeling exuberant spirits. The discussion drifted to politics and an argument was started, the conclusion of which was that Lyons had snatched Shelton's hat from his head. The latter indignantly demanded its return. Lyons refused and Shelton withdrew his revolver and shot Lyons in the abdomen. When his victim fell to the floor, Shelton took his hat from the hand of the wounded man and coolly walked away. He was subsequently arrested and locked up at the Chestnut Street station. Lyons was taken to the dispensary where his wounds were pronounced serious. More information came out during Shelton's trial. It turned out that Shelton had actually first crushed Lyons' hat. In retaliation, Lyons then did the same to him. Because of this, Shelton then drew his pistol, smacking Lyons in the head with it. Lyons then dove toward Shelton's gun, but then got shot. After Lyons passed away from the gunshot wound, Shelton was charged in the killing. He was convicted in 1897 and was sentenced to 25 years. He was paroled in 1909 but ended up back in prison only 2 years later for assault and robbery. Shelton passed away on March 11, 1912 from tuberculosis. Last on this list is by far the most famous case being covered. It is the case of the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. JonBenet was born on August 6 of 1990 to John and Patsy Ramsey. On Christmas Day 1996, her mother woke up to realize her daughter was missing when she found a handwritten random note in the home. After calling 911, Patsy also called many friends and family members. Police arrived on the scene and conducted a search of the property. Unfortunately, the search wasn't thorough and the officers didn't check all areas of the home. Believing that JonBenet was kidnapped as suggested in the ransom note, the officers only sealed off JonBenet's bedroom, believing that there would be no other evidence in the home. Many of the other individuals Patsy called showed up to the home, walking through it and even helping to clean up in areas. These are just a few instances of where investigators failed to do any type of decent police work surrounding the case. At 1 p.m. local time, about 7 hours after the police were initially called, John and a family friend were asked to search through the house by investigators to see if anything looked out of the ordinary to them. It was at this point that John discovered the body of JonBenét in a room in the basement, previously unsearched. JonBenét's mouth was covered in duct tape, her wrists and neck had a nylon cord around them, and her body was covered by a white sheet. An autopsy showed that JonBenét was killed by strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. Over 20 years later, no one has ever been convicted for the murder. There have been many theories behind who killed JonBenét, but unfortunately none of them have been able to be proven. Well guys, that concludes the list of 10 Christmas tragedies. However you're spending your time this holiday, I truly hope you enjoy it. But just remember, what's supposed to be the happiest day of the year could also end up being the worst day of your life. Merry Christmas, everyone. Be careful out there. You never know what could happen. And remember to always. John Bell and his wife Margaret had been married for 15 years before Margaret found out that she was pregnant. Despite there being no evidence that Margaret had ever been unfaithful to John, he was still convinced that the baby was not his and that Margaret had therefore been cheating on him. In the weeks leading up to Christmas of 1901, John had grown cold and become very distant. On Christmas Day of that same year, John came up with a plan of killing Margaret before killing himself. He confronted her with a gun to carry out his plan. Margaret fought back in an attempt to save her and her unborn child's lives, and in the struggle was shot in the eye, dying at the couple's Brooklyn, New York home. Rather than turning the gun on himself like he had originally planned, John was overcome with guilt. He left his home and turned himself in to the police.